Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, and welcome back to CLS Social Studies. Today we're going to be covering two treaties that had some lasting effects on the United States, as well as two treaties that you could say probably made the greatest impact during John Adams' presidency when he becomes president. So on November 19th, 1794, representatives of the United States and Great Britain signed Jay's Treaty, which sought to settle outstanding issues between the two countries that had been left unresolved since the American War for Independence. The treaty proved very unpopular with the American public, but it did accomplish the goal of maintaining peace between the two nations and preserving U.S. neutrality. Tensions between the United States and Britain remained high after the Revolutionary War as a result of three key issues. British exports flooded U.S. markets, while American exports were blocked by British trade restrictions and their tariffs. The British occupation of northern forts that the British government had agreed to vacate in the Treaty of Paris of 1783, as well as recurrent Native American attacks in these areas, also frustrated Americans. Finally, Britain's impressment of American sailors and seizure of naval and military supplies bound to enemy ports on neutral ships brought the two nations to the brink of war in the late 1700s. Now, impressment was the act of capturing U.S. sailors and forcing them to work in the British Navy. The French Revolution led to a war between Britain and France in 1793. Divisions emerged in the United States between those who supported the French, including Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, and those who supported the British, including Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton. Feeling the repercussions of war with Britain, President George Washington sided with Hamilton and sent pro-British Chief Justice John Jay to negotiate with the British government. Jay looked to Hamilton for specific instructions for the treaty. Hamilton recommended an approach that would both stabilize relations with Great Britain and guarantee increased trade between the United States and Great Britain. Jay's only bargaining chip in the negotiations was the threat that the United States would join the Danish and the Swedish governments in their defending their neutral status and resisting British seizure of their goods by force of arms. In an attempt to guarantee good relations with Britain, Hamilton independently informed the British leadership that the United States had no intention of joining in this neutral agreement. Hamilton sabotaged John Jay when he went to England. Hamilton's actions left Jay with very little leverage to force Britain to comply with U.S. demands. The resulting treaty addressed very few U.S. interests and ultimately granted Britain additional rights. The only concessions that Jay obtained was a surrender of the northwestern posts, which was already agreed to in the Treaty of Paris of 1783, and a commercial treaty with Great Britain that granted the United States a most favored trade partner, most favored nation status, but seriously restricted the U.S. commercial trade across to the British West Indies. All other outstanding issues, including the Canadian-Maine boundary, compensation for pre-revolutionary debts, and British seizures of American ships, were to be resolved by arbitration. Jay even conceded that the British could seize U.S. goods bound for France if they paid them and could confiscate without payment French goods on American ships. Jay's treaty was immensely unpopular with the American public, but it squeaked through the Senate on a 20-10 vote on June 24, 1795. President Washington implemented the treaty in the face of popular disapproval, realizing that it was the price of peace with Great Britain and that it gave the United States valuable time to consolidate and rearm in the event of a future conflict. Now, another treaty that the United States enters into is the Treaty of San Lorenzo in 1795, otherwise known as Pinckney's Treaty. Now, Spanish and U.S. negotiators concluded the Treaty of San Lorenzo, also known as Pinckney's Treaty, on October 27th, 1795. The treaty was an important diplomatic success for the United States. It resolved territorial disputes between the two countries and granted American ships the right to free navigation of the Mississippi River as well as duty-free transport through the port of New Orleans, which was under Spanish control. Prior to the treaty, the western and southern boundaries of the United States had been a source of tension between Spain and the United States. The U.S. border extended to the Mississippi River, but its southern stretch remained in Spanish territory, and Spanish officials, reluctant to encourage the United States trade and settlement in a strategic frontier area, kept the Mississippi River closed to American shipping. Moreover, both Spain and the United States claimed portions of the present-day states of Alabama and Mississippi, and earlier negotiations to resolve the territorial disputes had broken off inconclusively. The Spanish government maintained several forts in the disputed territories and could also count on indigenous resistance to U.S. attempts to survey or encroach upon Native American lands. U.S. citizens from the southern states and frontier areas found Spanish policies restrictive and wanted the U.S. government to renegotiate its positions. Prior to 1789, Spanish policy had focused on keeping American trade and settlement in frontier areas to a minimum, and so neither Spanish colonial officials nor policymakers in Madrid were interested in granting concessions to U.S. negotiators who had attempted to obtain earlier. However, Spanish interests changed during the wars of the French Revolution. Spain joined the other European monarchies in war against France in 1793, but in 1794 Spanish forces experienced defeats in the Caribbean and in Europe. Spanish King Charles IV, uninterested in managing political affairs, had earlier heated political and diplomatic King Charles IV, who was uninterested in managing political affairs, had earlier handed political and diplomatic responsibilities to his Prime Minister Manuel de Godoy. Now, Godoy sought to extract Spain from its alliance with traditional enemy Great Britain and to restore peace with France. Godoy's policy was not without risks, as antagonizing the British would put Spanish colonies in the Americas at risk. When the Spanish diplomats sought to shift Spanish alliances, U.S. diplomat John Jay arrived in London to negotiate a treaty with Great Britain. Spanish officials feared that Jay's negotiations would result in an Anglo-American alliance and an invasion of Spanish possessions in North America. Sensing the need for a rapprochement, Godoy sent a request to the U.S. government for a representative empowered to negotiate a new treaty. President George Washington selected South Carolinian Thomas Pinckney, who had been serving as a United States minister to Great Britain. Pinckney arrived in Spain in June of 1795, and negotiations proceeded swiftly. Spain's political and military position had weakened under its defeats at war, and war expenses were growing. While population growth in Kentucky and Tennessee, combined with a shortage of European ships to sustain trade with Louisiana, made Spanish officials amenable to a change in the restrictive Spanish trade policies. Godoy offered to accept the 31st parallel as the U.S.-Florida border, as well as the right to free navigation of the Mississippi, which Americans west of the Appalachians supported enthusiastically. In return, Godoy requested that the United States commit to an allegiance with Spain. Pinckney rejected the allegiance, and with further consultation, Godoy provided the same offer without the necessity of the alliance. Nevertheless, negotiations came to an impasse as the Spanish continued to insist on their right to require duties for goods passing through the Spanish-held port of New Orleans. Pinckney threatened to leave without signing a treaty unless the Spanish dropped duties on American trade passing through New Orleans. The next day, Godoy agreed to Pinckney's demands, and the two negotiators signed the treaty on October 27, 1795. The final treaty also voided Spanish guarantees of military support that colonial officials had made to Native Americans in the disputed regions, greatly weakening those communities' ability to resist encroachment upon their lands. Pinckney's treaty enabled and encouraged American settlers to continue westward expansion and made frontier areas more attractive and lucrative. Consequently, it was popular with the American public, especially in the West and South. Since Thomas Pinckney was associated with the Federalist Party, the treaty served to bolster the Federalists outside their New England stronghold and give the party a stronger base in areas where it had traditionally been weak. Diplomatically, the treaty marked a reverse in Spanish policies that attempted to maintain a strong buffer region in North America while placing the United States in a stronger position to relation with European powers compared to the U.S. concessions made in Jay's Treaty. So these were two major treaties, one a commercial treaty with Britain, one a land-gaining treaty with Spain. One was very unpopular, one was very popular. And we'll see how these treaties affect John Adams' presidency after George Washington leaves the presidential office. I'll see you next time.